Hello, my name is Professor Theo Farrell. I'm the Deputy Vice-Chancellor and Vice President at the University of Wollongong in Australia and Senior Research Associate at the Royal United Services Institute in London. From 2006 to 2016, I was a professor in the Department of War Studies at King's College London, which is obviously relevant with regards to what I'm going to discuss today. So I've been requested by the Independent Inquiry relating to Afghanistan to provide a lecture on Britain's war in Afghanistan from 2001 to 2021. So this lecture will comprise the following 7 sections. The first section will be about Afghanistan, looking at the background to the country and its peoples, and including some brief history on past conflicts involving Britain. The second section, on the rise and fall of the Islamic Emirate from the 1990s to 2001, will examine how the Taliban rose from the chaos of civil war to impose law and order on the country, and how the Taliban's brutal Islamic regime was overthrown by the United States in revenge for the 9/11 terrorist attacks. The third section, on the formation and expansion of ISAF, which is the International Security Assistance Force, covering the period 2001 to 2004, will examine Prime Minister Tony Blair's role in shaping a hugely ambitious international effort to stabilise and rebuild Afghanistan, and the circumstances that led to NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation, taking charge of the ISAF mission. The fourth section, the Battle for Helmand from 2005 to 2008, will examine how Britain ended up in Helmand province, a remote backwater in southern Afghanistan, and the intense fighting that unfolded between British forces and a growing Taliban insurgency. The fifth section on Britain's counter-insurgency war from 2009 to 2011 will examine the high point of the British campaign, and the impact of the United States surge of forces into Afghanistan on Britain's campaign in Helmand. So it's going to look at a series of offensives by British, United States and Afghan forces to clear the Taliban from central Helmand. A sixth section on the path to defeat, covering the period 2012 to 2021, will examine how NATO increasingly focused on exiting Afghanistan and progressively transferring responsibility for fighting to the Taliban onto the Afghan army and police, and the circumstances that led to the Afghan state and its war effort to collapse in 2021. And a final section on the fall of Kabul in 2021 will examine what happened when the Taliban seized Kabul, including the huge Western evacuation effort, and provide some concluding observations about life under the Taliban. This lecture draws on, in terms of source material, in particular a book that I wrote called Unwinnable, Britain's War in Afghanistan, that was published, the revised edition was published by Vintage in 2021. So this work draws on years of research, including multiple visits to Afghanistan to undertake assessments for the British Ministry of Defence and ISAF Command. Now, in those various trips and assessments, I reviewed a wide range of internal documents, including intelligence assessments, military plans, and post-operation reports. Now, obviously, I'm not revealing any classified material in this book, but all of this information informs the assessments that I make in the book about Britain's military campaign in Afghanistan. The book also draws on hundreds of interviews with military officers from Britain, America, and other NATO countries, as well as Afghan officers and Afghan civilians. And finally, for the book, I also commissioned Afghan researchers to interview 67 Taliban field commanders over 2011 to 2012 to give us an insight into the Taliban's campaign in Helmand province. So, there's a lot to cover in this lecture. I'll try to get through as much as I can, but for those interested in more detail, then I'd recommend you check out this book. So let's turn now to the first section, which is the background on Afghanistan. Now, as you can see in the next slide, Afghanistan is a landlocked country in Central Asia. To the north, you have the countries of Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan, and to the northwest. To the northeast, you have China. To the east and south, you've got the long border with Pakistan, and to the west, you've got Iran. Now, the landlocked nature of Afghanistan has very important consequences for the West's war effort in Afghanistan. And this concerns what the military call lines of communication, which in plain speak are the logistic lines whereby you bring in supplies. And it meant that for the most part, during the United States and NATO war in Afghanistan, supplies had to be brought into the southern Pakistan port of Karachi and trucked across Pakistan into Afghanistan. And that has very significant implications with regards to the West's dependency on Pakistan to essentially enable the bringing in of supplies for the war effort. So Afghanistan's a very large country. It's about 250,000 square miles, so over 2.5 times the size of the United Kingdom. It's mostly mountainous, and it's dominated by the Hindu Kush mountain range that sweeps across the country. In terms of the major cities, you've got Kandahar to the south, which is the second largest city, Herat to the west, Mazar-Sharif and Kunduz to the north, and Jalalabad in the east, as well as the capital, Kabul. The United Nations estimated that the Afghan population in 2020 was around about 38 million. And the population is mostly rural, with only about 20% living in the urban centres, and about 4 to 5 million people in Kabul. Now, in 2001, Afghanistan had the largest refugee population in the world, with conflict having driven around about 10% of the population, over 3.5 million people, to flee the country. Most of these refugees, around 3 million, were living in Pakistan and Iran. And that includes a whole series of very large refugee camps in Pakistan. And as the Taliban insurgency takes off in the 2000s, these become, in effect, home bases for the Taliban. It's where their families live, it's where they recruit a lot of their fighters, and it's where a lot of their fighters retreat, particularly in the winter months, to recuperate from the fighting. Afghanistan is an Islamic country, so even under the period in the 2000s, those 2 decades when you had Western support for the Afghan government, it was known as the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. So 85% of the population are Sunni Muslim and only about 15% are Shia. Politically, modern Afghanistan is organised into about 34 provinces and around 400 districts. Historically, rule from Kabul has been weak in Afghanistan, and for the most part, warlords have exercised considerable power locally. Now, ethnic and tribal identities are also core to the politics and social organisation of the country. So in terms of the main ethnic groups, in terms of size and power, you've got the Pashtuns, the Tajiks, and the Uzbeks. The Pashtuns form the largest bloc, around 40% of the population, and predominate in the south and the east of the country. And the Taliban are basically a Pashtun movement. The Tajiks, the next largest ethnic group, with around 27% of the population, predominate in the northeast of Afghanistan. Uzbeks, forming just under 10% of the population, dominate in the north and northwest of the country. So Tajik and Uzbek warlords led resistance to the Taliban's Islamic Emirate in the 1990s. And the government, Afghan government and security forces from 2001 to 2021 were dominated by Tajiks, Uzbeks. So another notable ethnic group are the Hazaras. So they're about 10% of the population, who are mainly in central Afghanistan. They've suffered serious discrimination, including documented human rights abuse under the Taliban. Now, within each ethnicity are a complex web of tribal and subtribal identities. So, for instance, within the Pashtun ethnic identity, you've got 2 of the largest tribal groups or tribal federations are the Durrani and the Ghilzai. And within Durrani, for instance, some of the major tribal subgroups are the Barakzai, the Alikazai, the Nurzai, and the Ishkazai. And this tribal difference actually is quite significant to the conflict in Helmand. Now, the Afghans have long memories of the English. Britain has previously been involved in 3 conflicts in Afghanistan. The First Anglo-Afghan War of 1839 to 1842, the Second Anglo-Afghan War of 1879 to 1882, and the Third Anglo-Afghan War of 1919. So the First and Second Anglo-Afghan Wars are remarkably similar in terms of how they unfolded. Both involved Britain sending in forces to dispose Afghan rulers. Both involved Afghan uprisings against foreign occupiers and the slaughtering of British garrisons that had been left behind in Kabul. And both involved the return of large British Indian armies to exact retribution on the Afghans. The Third Anglo-Afghan War in 1919 was really just a border incursion into India by an upstart new Afghan ruler, and that was easily crushed by the British Indian Army. So in rural Afghan society, where oral traditions of passing knowledge down through generations still persist, history has a very different, more personal and resonant quality than perhaps it does in the West. And so in the early 2000s, when the British Army returns to Afghanistan, many Afghans actually had cultural memories of previous British invasions. In Helmand province, where the British would return in 2006, many locals still recalled and indeed celebrated the humiliating defeat of a British force by Afghan tribesmen about 60 kilometres away at the Battle of Maiwand in 1880. So let's turn to the next section, the rise and fall of the Islamic Emirate. And so Afghanistan is a country shaped by decades of war. Really of significance is the Mujahideen War between 1979 and 1989, which was caused by the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 and the rallying of Islamic Mujahideen, so hundreds of different Mujahideen groups that rose up to fight the Soviet invaders for basically over a decade. When the Soviets retreated in 1989, they left behind a puppet regime, and so the fight by the Mujahideen continued against the puppet regime until the Kabul fell to Mujahideen forces in 1992. There was a brief period of a couple of years as the various warlords tried to consolidate power, and then Afghanistan collapsed into a brutal civil war from around about 1994 to 1998. And it's this period that gave rise to the Taliban. So the Taliban originate in southern Afghanistan, in Kandahar. It's a Pashtun movement, as I've said, and it grows out of the Soviet war in the 1980s. So in that war, we see many different Afghan Mujahideen fighting groups that are being raised by tribal leaders to fight the Soviets, mainly from refugee camps. And the Taliban were one of these Mujahideen groups, but they differed because they were mostly formed of young men from religious schools in Pakistan on the border with Afghanistan. And these young men were motivated by Islamic jihad to wage war on the Soviet infidels. So Talib actually is Arabic for student, and it indicates the importance of Islamic teachings as a key motivating factor for Taliban fighters. So after the Soviet war, Afghanistan fragments into various warlords controlling regions. In the west and the north, we actually see the emergence of pretty effective self-governing regions under really powerful warlords. And these actually provide a modicum of public services. However, in the south, in the Pashtun areas of the south and east, there's far greater turmoil. There's a much greater tapestry of various warlords of various sizes and their militias, and there's total collapse of public services, and there's quite extensive predation on local populations. So the Taliban emerge in 1994. They re-emerge actually in 1994 under the leadership of Mullah Muhammad Omar to impose law and order, initially in the south and the east, and they do this through brutal suppression of the abusive warlords. It's in this period that we see Osama bin Laden arrive in Afghanistan in 1996. He's actually not a guest of the Taliban at this point. He's invited in by other Mujahideen leaders. But as the Taliban expand across, as they wage their campaign of law and order across Afghanistan, they encounter Osama bin Laden in eastern Afghanistan. And initially, they don't know what to make of him. But he makes himself quite indispensable to the Taliban as they're waging their what effectively becomes a war against the Tajiks and the Uzbeks. So he equips and supplies training camps, particularly for Arab fighters that are flowing in for the war against the ongoing jihad, and he provides financial support to the Taliban, including $3 million US dollars of his own money. So eventually, by late 1996, the Taliban have conquered about 90% of the country, and you just have a northern part of the country. So it's the northeast, particularly around the Panjshir Valley, that's been held out against them under the Tajik forces of Ahmad Shah Massoud. So the rest of the country is under Taliban rule. And the Taliban bring a pretty brutal form of rule. It's marked by strict interpretation of Islamic law that's enforced by religious police and harsh punishment. And it's particularly marked by the suppression of women's rights. So women are basically banned from the public sphere. They have to wear burqa. They're not allowed to work. It causes immense hardship on Afghan women, particularly those that don't have husbands. So they have to somehow eke a living for themselves, but they're not allowed to work. And this indeed presents the normalization of relations with the West, because Western countries are horrified by the brutality of the Taliban regime, and in particular the suppression of women's rights. So 9/11, the terrorist attacks of 9/11 are the trigger for Britain and America's war in Afghanistan. Almost 3,000 people perished in those attacks. And that includes 67 British civilians who were killed in the attacks in New York. So, this is one of the greatest terrorist attacks against British civilians, as well as, of course, the greatest terrorist attack against America. The damage is so extensive in New York, the two trade towers being taken down, it causes $10 billion worth of damage. It was quite evident that the United States was going to respond militarily. So in the weeks that followed, the Americans were putting pressure, immense pressure on the Taliban to simply hand over Osama bin Laden, but they were also preparing for war. And indeed, the American response came within a matter of weeks. It started with a bombing campaign on the 7th of October. And in essence, the slight problem that the United States had was there was very little to bomb in Afghanistan because it had been so comprehensively destroyed by decades of war. There actually literally weren't many targets for American bombers. So the American military effort primarily focused actually on the deployment of CIA special operatives and US special operations forces that flew into Afghanistan covertly, and they brought with them suitcases of cash, and they brought with them laser designators to guide more accurately American bombers. And they went in to support the anti-Taliban forces that were still active in Afghanistan, and in particular the Tajik forces of Ahmad Shah Massoud in the northeast, as well as anti-Taliban Uzbek forces. And so they used money to get more allies to join the anti-Taliban coalition, but also to use laser designators to target Taliban front lines, because in effect the Taliban had put a whole series of trench lines to contain the 10% of the country that they didn't have under their control. So initially the Taliban actually put up a conventional resistance to this renewed military effort by anti-Taliban forces. And so you have Taliban that are effectively presenting themselves as light infantry, either in their trench lines or arriving in convoys of pickup trucks. And they became pretty easy targets for US air power, particularly guided by US Special Forces operators with laser designators. And so they were utterly obliterated by the United States Air Force. And so Taliban front lines pretty quickly crumble, enabling Tajik and Uzbek forces to break out of the north and sweep down. So by the 13th of November, the anti-Taliban Northern Alliance had seized Kabul. By early December, the Taliban homeland of Kandahar had fallen to anti-Taliban forces. And by December, the United States, we see the establishment of an interim government under Hamid Karzai, and he had actually led one of the anti-Taliban groups in the south, and he eventually becomes president thereafter, and he serves as president from 2002 to 2014. So what happened then is by early 2002, most of the Taliban had either basically fled the country to Pakistan, including most of the Taliban leaders. Some Taliban returned to their home districts in southern and eastern Afghanistan. They just buried their weapons and they just went to ground and they went home. So let's turn now to the next section, which is the formation and expansion of the International Security Assistance Force, ISAF, from 2001 to 2004. So what we see in December is Britain leading the deployment of a 5,000 strong peacekeeping force called the International Security Assistance Force, or ISAF, into Kabul. And interesting enough, so this was led by Britain. The headquarters was provided by 3 Division, but it included a battalion from the Parachute Regiment. And its job was basically to protect the new government of Hamid Karzai, but also to ensure that there was peace within Kabul, because there was a concern on the part of the Blair government and some other Western countries that we might see a return to civil conflict, because the previous period in the 1990s had seen the major warlord groups fight over Kabul as a prize. So this was to stop that. Now, Tony Blair is really instrumental here in the establishment of ISAF. He strongly believed in the international communities having a responsibility to help stabilize and rebuild Afghanistan. And in fact, he actually had wider ambitions that ISAF would be a larger force and would have a mission that took it well beyond Kabul. But there was very little appetite on the part of the Americans and some other Western governments for such an ambitious undertaking. In terms of where Blair's coming from, you could look at the Strategic Defence Review, Britain's Strategic Defence Review of 1998. And in that, it declares that Britain is going to be a force for good in the world. And this is something that Blair championed, but also his Foreign Secretary, Robin Cook. And he talks about how Britain would not, quote, stand idly by and watch humanitarian disasters or aggression of dictators go unchecked. So we can see a track record here under Blair of the British military being committed for humanitarian causes. You see it in terms of the ramping up of the British commitment and French commitment and others in Bosnia. That eventually results in the ending of the Bosnian conflict in 1995. You see it in a very robust position that's adopted by Britain with regards to using military force to stop Serb aggression in Kosovo. This is the Kosovo War of 1999. And you see it in Blair commissioning a British force to go into Sierra Leone and to stabilise the situation there in 2000. So Blair really leads the way in Europe and internationally in terms of this new doctrine of humanitarian intervention. But the SDR, the Strategic Defence Review of 1998, also talks about not just simply using force overseas in terms of an ethical doctrine, but also in terms of a strategic logic. And that is that British forces, quote, must be prepared to go to the crisis rather than have the crisis come to us. So, it's this notion that really the world was a global village, and it's no longer the case that Britain or any other Western country could just ignore these very unstable parts of the world and not expect some of that insecurity to spill across into Europe. And in many ways, that's a very prescient view, actually. So we see the deployment of ISAF to prevent both the humanitarian disaster in Afghanistan, but also future terrorism attacks against the West. That was the thinking. And in many ways, the United States was happy for the British to take the lead. So this is the time we have President George W. Bush, who's the president. And what you see under the Bush administration is that they rapidly lose interest in Afghanistan. And the context here is, within a matter of days of the terrorist attacks 9/11, the Bush administration declaring a global war on terror. And this is a war against, any parts of the world and regimes that were sponsoring terror in Americans' eyes. And the neocons, these kind of more hardline folk inside the Bush administration, were actually agitating to expand the war quite quickly into Iraq, to target the regime of Saddam Hussein. That sort of unfinished business from the 1990 to 1991 Gulf War. So already, by as early as the 21st of November 2001, U.S. Central Command, which had been planning and executing the war in Afghanistan, was instructed to also prepare plans for war in Iraq. So midway through, conducting the war in Afghanistan. So over 2002 and 2003, two developments lead to the expansion of ISAF beyond Kabul. The first is that the United States joined the rest of the international community in 2002 in committing billions of dollars to fund Afghanistan, reconstruction in Afghanistan. So Ironically, actually, this was not about the Bush administration becoming more involved in Afghanistan, but quite the opposite. It was an attempt by the US administration to accelerate its exit from Afghanistan. So in other words, the faster you could build up the Afghan state to look after itself, then the faster you can get out. The second development is that NATO agreed to take responsibility for the mission in Afghanistan. So after initially Britain's leadership of ISAF, it was passed to a bunch of other countries, the Turkey and Germany, but actually you needed a more it was either going to have to go back to the Americans to lead the mission, or NATO needed to step in. You needed a much stronger capability in terms of the headquarters. And so NATO agreed to take charge of the mission in 2003. Really, this was a way for the European members to heal a very serious rift that had occurred within the Atlantic Alliance over the war in Iraq, when France and Germany in particular very strongly opposed America's war in Iraq, and it led to a very serious rift in early 2003 in the NATO alliance. And as the relations were repairing, this is a way for the Europeans to say, okay, we're going to shoulder our responsibility of global security and a burden. So we'll take charge of Afghanistan, so you, the Americans, can deal with the problem, deal with your ongoing war in Iraq. So as you can see in the next slide, what we see is the counterclockwise strategy that's adopted by NATO for expanding ISAF. So this involves the deployment of civil military, what are called provincial reconstruction teams, or PRTs. So civil military PRTs to the various regions. So provincial reconstruction teams are military task forces and civilian task forces combined. And the job of the military task forces is to provide the security for civilian-led development operations to occur. And so we initially see the Germans and the Norwegians deploy PRTs to the north. Britain actually had a PRT in the north at the time, and so it pulls that back, and the Germans and the Norwegians go there. And we see the Italians and the Spanish deploy PRTs to the west. And these were the parts of the country that were most permissive. So, the north and the west is where we see the predominance of Tajik and Uzbek ethnicities. These tend to be anti-Taliban. They were fairly peaceful at the time. So the countries that really aren't that interested in fighting, they deploy PRTs on what are effectively peacekeeping and reconstruction missions to these parts. But it was well understood within NATO that as you deploy into the south and the east, you're entering the Pashtun heartlands, where the Taliban are, and where there's most potential for conflict. And so that proved to be a more challenging proposition. And so really by 2004, the counterclockwise expansion of ISAF had stalled. At the NATO summit in June 2004, Britain agrees to take responsibility for command of ISAF by deploying the British-led Allied Rapid Reaction Corps, or the ARC, ARRC. So that's a British-led headquarters within NATO that has responsibility for what are called core levels. It's above division, core level operations. But we still needed to see a number of NATO states agreeing to actually deploy forces. And so in 2005, the Blair government agrees that Britain will lead the ISAF expansion into the south. And in the south, you have three provinces. You've got the province of Kandahar, you've got Helmand next to it, and above it, you've got Ruzgan. So Kandahar was the most important province because that contains the second largest city of Afghanistan, Kandahar city. And it would be logical for Britain, the most powerful military, non-US military state, to actually take on that mission. But actually, Kandahar went to the Canadians because they insisted on being allowed to deploy into Kandahar. And in part, that's because they recognized the importance of Kandahar, and the Canadian military was very keen to prove its worth, particularly after the failure of its mission in Somalia, well over a decade before. So Ruzgan was the least important of the three provinces, and that's given to the Dutch and the Australians to send in task forces. And so really that leaves Helmand, which is what Britain takes responsibility for. And it's really a remote backwater in terms of it's a deeply rural, very large, deeply rural province. But it's also the province which has most of the drug production in Afghanistan. 46% of the entire poppy crop in Afghanistan is produced in Helmand. And Britain was the lead nation within the international coalition of nations with responsibility for counter-narcotics. And so in that sense, there was an attempt at a certain logic as to why Britain would go there. So let's turn to the next section, which is the Battle for Helmand, looking at the period from 2005 to 2008. And so you can see the shape of Helmand in the next slide. It's it's a really sizable province. The agriculture in Helmand, and indeed most of the population of Helmand, are concentrated along the line of the Helmandi River, and you can see it indicated there with the sort of the green strip, which is where most of the irrigation is. And the rest of Helmand is mountainous and quite desert-like. But in that very lush area around the Helmandi River, as it snakes down through valleys, you've got a lot of agriculture, a lot of poppy production. The major capital of Helmand is Lashkargah. Just north to it is the town of Goresh, which is one of the major economic hubs, and it's on Highway 1, which is the highway that goes around Afghanistan. So it's a major commercial centre in Helmand. And north of that again is Sangin, which is the real heartland of the narcotic trade in Helmand. And then very much to the far north of that is the district of Musakala, which is one of the districts that the British end up deploying forces into. Helmand offered the British Army an opportunity to pivot out of Iraq. So following the March 2003 invasion of Iraq, Britain had been given responsibility of the 4 southernmost provinces, including Basra, which contained Iraq's second largest city. British troop numbers rapidly declined following the invasion force from what was 46,000 in the invasion force down to 18,000 just a few months later in May 2003 to 8,500 in May 2004. So the British force shrinks, but that's still a really sizable force for a small army to maintain in Iraq. And this period coincided with Iraq descending into a really vicious civil war between the Sunni minority, which held power under Saddam Hussein, and the Shia majority. So Britain in particular faced a fierce uprising by the Mahdi army, a Shia militia that dominated southern Iraq. And the Mahdi army laid siege to British bases in Basra. And what we see from mid-April, for instance, to end of June, are an average of 5 attacks per day on British forces in the city. So you have increased pressure on the British army, on British forces in Iraq, and combined with that was growing opposition to the war back home. The Iraq War is basically deeply popular. So Helmand, from the point of view of the British military, was seen as offering a way out. British forces could take on a major role by leading the expansion of ISAF into the south. It was seen as playing to UK military strengths because this notion that the British Army was good at counterinsurgency. And it was an honourable way to leave. They weren't just dumping the Americans in Iraq. They were able to say to the Americans, look, we are leaving the south of Iraq, but it's actually to take on this mission. And if we didn't do this, you would have to do this thing in Afghanistan. And crucially, from the point of view of the Ministry of Defence, Afghanistan was seen as a more virtuous mission. It was a good war in comparison to Iraq, which was a bad war. But importantly, the pivot strategy depended on the British Army getting out of Iraq in order to go into Afghanistan. And this was something that the Ministry of Defence was concerned about. Would they be able to get out of Iraq at sufficient speed to be able to actually pivot into Afghanistan? And indeed, this is something that was raised by Defence Secretary Geoff Hume in early 2005 when he was worried about the British Army being asked to wage 2 enduring campaigns at the same time, something that was really going to be an immense struggle for the British Army. So what we see in May 2005 is that Geoff Hume, who was seen as a fairly mild-mannered Secretary of State for Defence, is replaced by John Reid, a different politician of a different character, a much kind of tougher politician, and he was brought in May to essentially, quote, stiffen resolve in the MOD. So the view was that in 2005, the UK had to commit to go into the south in order to create a snowball effect and so break the logjam in NATO, and that would bring with it the Canadians, the Dutch, the Danish, and the Australians into the south. And as I've said, Britain found itself, by default, effectively given Helmand. So the British deployed into Helmand knowing almost nothing about the place. In mid-2005, the newly formed Post-Conflict Reconstruction Unit, which was contained in the Department for International Development, and was tasked with producing an assessment for Whitehall. And this was a desktop exercise and interviewing anyone they could find in Britain who had any understanding of Afghanistan. So one of the people they interviewed was the ex-diplomat Rory Stewart, who had walked across almost the entirety of Afghanistan in 2002 and written a really marvelous book about the experience. And when they spoke to him, he said, quote, that Helmand was, quote, the most dangerous province in the country, and that, quote, you would be crazy to deploy there. But anyway, that was where Britain were going. So in late 2005, the Post-Conflict Reconstruction Unit was deployed into southern Afghanistan, and they joined a preliminary ops team that had been deployed by the Permanent Joint Headquarters into Kandahar airfield. And from that, they made brief trips into Lashkar to check out Helmand. On one of their visits, they visited the United States PRT, which was actually a really sizable U.S. Special Forces task force that was in Lashkar, a couple hundred strong. And they were told by the Americans that actually the province was pretty quiet and there was little fighting. And the US commander there said to them that, but he did say, look, all the police here are involved in drugs. So when the Afghan National Police say, as he put it, when they say they are in a shootout with the Taliban, they're actually involved in a drug war. So what we see in 2005 are the return of warlords and their tribal militia to Helmand. These are the kind of characters that the Taliban had risen up in the 1990s to remove from power because of the abuses that they inflicted on the local population. And what we can see on the next slide are three of the leading characters. So you've got Sher Mohammad Akhundzada, who's an Alizai warlord from Musakala, and he's appointed provincial governor. You've got Abdul Rahman Jan, who's a Norzai warlord from Nadi Ali, and he's appointed chief of police. And Dad Muhammad Khan, who's an Alizai warlord from Sangin, and he's appointed chief of the National Directorate of Security. And so they occupy these official state positions, but in reality they have their own militia. And in many ways, what they do is they give benefits to those who are allied with their tribal networks, and they prey on other tribal groups and the population who aren't allied with them. And so this really sows the seed of conflict to come. What you see are district leaders who had been selected by local tribal shura are shoved aside and replaced by corrupt officials. You see many of the Taliban who had surrendered weapons and just gone home. They start to become targets for U.S. Special Operations Forces raids. These night raids really infuriate local communities because they involve U.S. special operators, kicking down the doors at night and raiding people's personal compounds, and this is hugely offensive in Pashtun culture. And crucially, many innocent people are just caught up in this U.S. secret detention campaign. So the U.S. give bounties. They provide bounties for high-value targets, and in essence, they're given incentives for people to denounce tribal and business rivals to get them out of the picture, or even just to sell innocent people, claiming that they are, high-value targets. And what you find also are that the tribal groups, therefore, that are disempowered under the new government, who aren't allied with Sher Mohammad Akhundzada or Abdul Rahman Jan, they become disempowered, and so they will naturally gravitate towards the Taliban. Actually, the British realised there's a problem here, and so they insist in 2005 on Sher Mohammad Akhundzada being removed and a new governor being appointed. And he is removed by Karzai reluctantly, because Karzai sees him as an ally, and a technocrat is appointed in his place. But actually, that makes matters worse, because what happens, therefore, is that his tribal militia that control the north of Helmand, particularly around Musakala, they turn against the government that's establishing itself in Helmand, and indeed the British when they arrive, and they instead work with the Taliban. And then finally, what we see as the British arrive in 2006, but particularly in 2007, is that the British military support government-led counter-narcotics operations in 2007. And this really just pours fuel on the fire and leads to a general public uprising, because so many communities in Helmand are involved one way or another in the drugs trade. And so in targeting in supporting the counter-narcotics effort, in effect, the British military are attacking the livelihood of a large segment of the population. Now, plans, the UK's plans in Afghanistan were, you've got plans at two levels. You've got the national strategic plans in Whitehall, and then you've got plans for Helmand. And the UK strategic aim for Afghanistan was very ambitious, in fact, arguably excessively so. It was for the establishment of effective representative government, for the development of security forces that were capable of creating an environment for sustainable economic and social development to occur. And this is actually a huge ask for a country that had been effectively, torn apart by war. The US ambassador's view, indeed, in 2005, reflecting on the perspective he saw in Washington, and the same could apply in Whitehall, was that officials back in Washington were, ridiculously over-optimistic about the potential for progress, and that their plans were, in his own words, ludicrous, actually. The initial UK joint plan that had been produced by the Post-Conflict Reconstruction Unit and the preliminary ops team from Permanent Joint Headquarters, interesting enough, was much more modest. Because they had gone in on the ground, they realised just how little actually the British knew about Helmand, and that induced a caution. So this plan called for a very cautious approach. For the British task force, when it deploys, just to focus on providing security around Lashkar, the provincial capital, and Goresh, the major commercial town just north of Lashkar. And in particular, it said that the British military should not deploy out of these areas because it simply didn't know enough about the human terrain, so the local culture and the players beyond these areas. And instead, it's working from Lashkar and Goresh. The focus should be on developing knowledge of the cultural landscape and developing relationships with key stakeholders. Now, what we see from April 2006 is the British military deploy a series of task forces. So each task force the deployment is for 6 months. So we see the rotation of a task force after task force for 6 months. Each is led by a brigadier. There's an interesting question about why we see them deploy for such short periods. And the argument is that the intensity of operations was such that the troops just get worn out. And there is some evidence to support this. The Americans tended to do longer deployments of between 9 and 12 months. And you could see actually that the frontline infantry companies and battalions were getting worn out by the sheer intensity of operations. But what it also does, however, is that it means that because not only the frontline battalions switch every 6 months, but the actual brigade headquarters changes every 6 months, that you get a lack of campaign continuity. Because each brigadier, as he arrives, brings a new interpretation of what the British should focus on. And so there's this remarkable feature where each brigadier and each brigade, certainly for the first couple of years, does something different. And so we're not getting the accumulation of effects. And crucially, from the point of view of Afghan partners, they are just waiting for the next guy to come and do something different. And crucially, the point of the task forces was for the military to support civilian-led provincial reconstruction team. So for the military to provide a sort of shield to protect the civilians as they went about their business, and to create a bit of a security bubble around the civilian-led reconstruction and development efforts. And in fact, what we see with the British task forces, that instead they focus on conducting military operations to defeat the Taliban. So in January 2006, the Secretary of State for Defence, John Reid, announces to the House of Commons that the UK is going to deploy to Helmand. And he describes the size of the task force, which is a fairly modest task force of 3,300 troops drawn from 16 Air Assault Brigade. including only one battalion of infantry, which is about 1,500 strong. So in effect, the British only have about 1,500 deployable infantry. So this task force, it's quite apparent, is chronically under-resourced for the mission it faces. And in particular with regards to helicopters, it only has 6 transport helicopters, and nowhere near enough actually for what turns out to be a very challenging operation where troops and supplies have to be helicoptered all over Helmand. So what were the drivers for the deployment of a very modest-sized task force? And bearing in mind that next door the Canadians had deployed a much larger task force of artillery and armoured vehicles. Well, there were 3 drivers here. The first are Treasury concerns about cost. So the Treasury were looking at this thinking we really want to, we've just fought a very expensive war in Iraq. We need to contain the costs of this mission in Afghanistan. So they impose a cap of $1 billion, a £1 billion cap for a mission that's expected to last 3 years. The second is a judgment from Tony Blair and John Reid about what the cabinet would tolerate. And again, it's a sense of we really can't push our luck too much here. And the third is a concern from military chiefs about overextending the military. Now, Whitehall and Washington, D.C. completely failed to see the storm clouds that are gathering over southern Afghanistan. So what had happened is that the Taliban had retreated to Pakistan, the Taliban leadership, and by 2003, the Taliban leadership had begun to reorganize and established a leadership shura in the city of Quetta. From 2004 to 2005, we see the return of small Taliban vanguard teams. So these are sort of 4 to 6 guys on Honda 50 motorbikes that cross the border from Pakistan into southern Afghanistan. And they're going into the districts and the rural areas, and they're beginning to scout out who might support them, which sub-tribal groups or communities are disenfranchised and might support them. Who are the people who are supporting the government? They begin to intimidate those people, and there's also a campaign of assassination, and basically create instability in rural areas. And they're laying the foundations for a larger scale return of the Taliban, which occurs over 2005 and 2006, as Taliban return in very significant numbers into southern Afghanistan. So officials in Whitehall and Washington just don't pick this up. There's some elevation of conflict that occurs in Helmand and other provinces, but this is misread as just, disputes over drugs, so drug fights. In contrast, the U.S. Embassy is accurately detecting the picture. And in March 2006, it warns that the insurgency has gained momentum in Helmand. And the US ambassador in particular warns in 2006 that, quote, it would be an extremely bloody year. But all these warnings fell on deaf ears in London. So John Reid, he declares in mid-2006 that we will be perfectly happy to leave Helmand province in 3 years and without firing one shot, because our job is to protect the reconstruction, end quote. Well, in the first 6 months of the campaign, British troops fired almost 500,000 rounds. So what we see is the conflict in Helmand grows in intensity very quickly over 2006. And this results in a steady increase in the size of the task force. Very quickly, 16 Air Assault Brigade had to be reinforced with the 2nd Battalion of Infantry. And what we see between 2006 and 2009 is that the UK task force, which becomes known as Task Force Helmand, triples in size. And this puts immense strain on the British Army, given its inability to fully extract itself from Iraq. So as we can see from this table here, the British Army, you can see how the drawdown in Iraq is much slower than anticipated. And the combined effect of the numbers that British have to maintain in Iraq and Afghanistan and how many troops that means are deployed. So the British Army in 2006 had 108,000 soldiers. In terms of the fighting force, the Army comprised 7 Type A deployable brigades, each with around about 5,000 troops. And the UK also had the Royal Marines 3 Commander Brigade. So the important point here is that for every brigade on operations, there are 4 more brigades that are on rotation, either post-operation recovery or spinning up for pre-operation deployment. So by 2006, therefore, the Army didn't have sufficient deployable brigades for Iraq and Afghanistan. And that actually required in 2007 that they had to convert a Type B brigade into a Type A deployable brigade just to plug the gap. So that gives an idea of the extreme pressure that was on the British Army and on the availability of resources in theatre because of having to run 2 enduring campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, deploying British task forces really had an impossible mission in Helmand. Their job was to support the extension of Afghan central government to Helmand and civilian-led international efforts to bring improvement to public services and infrastructure. But what they found in Helmand was an economy mobilised around criminality, corruption and the drug trade. They found government structures captured by tribal and criminal interests, a totally dysfunctional and corrupt judicial system, and that's quite important in a rural setting because there's constant disputes over land and water. So ineffective judiciary has a very significant impact on the rural population. They also found a largely uneducated, tribally fragmented and highly hostile population. And lastly, and really importantly, was a vast cultural and linguistic gap between locals and the British. I mean, they didn't speak the language and they really didn't understand the culture. And what's very important here is the British went to engage in counterinsurgency, or what's commonly called COIN. And it's widely understood that where counterinsurgency differs from regular warfare is that in regular warfare, your basic job is to destroy enemy forces, and that's the path to victory. Whereas in counterinsurgency, your job is to win hearts and minds. That's the path to success, and to win support on the part of the population for the government. But if you don't speak the language and you don't understand the culture, then how on earth are you going to win hearts and minds? So to give an idea of the kind of ways that the brigades try to tackle this challenge, because on top of the corruption and criminality in Helmand, the fragmented tribal system, hostile population, all of these things, you also had a returning Taliban in 2005 and 6, and a growing strength of Taliban insurgency. So let's look at in a bit of detail at how the first 3 brigades fared and the ways that they tried to respond to the challenges they found. So the first brigade, which was deployed in April 2006, was led by Brigadier Ed Butler, and this was from 16 Air Assault Brigade. So very modest in size, as we've said. Initially, they only had 1,500 troops that were really on ground holding infantry. And initially deployed into Lashkar and Goreshk, and there was also a British base that had been built called Bastion, which is out in the desert in Helmand. So the British were deployed in these locations. But very quickly they came under immense pressure by Governor Mohammed Daoud, the technocrat that had been appointed by Karzai to replace Shir Mohammad Akhundzada. And they came under pressure from Daoud to deploy up north to the district centres of Musa Qala and Sangin, and also Nadi Ali, which is slightly to the south of Lashkar. And that's because he was trying to establish a presence of government. There was no effective presence. There were police there, but not really an effective government presence. He was receiving reports that the Taliban were encroaching into these areas, and they might have been Taliban, but they equally could have just been, different tribal militia. And so he put pressure on the British to deploy into them. And so under pressure, Ed Butler agreed to send in small packages, detachments of troops into these areas to work with the police. What they found were, really, in the words of one soldier, the police were pretty much a joke. So, heavily drug use by the police. They were actually mostly there to shake down the population for bribes. A lot of the police were actually tribal militia. And there wasn't much for the army to do but to actually just hold the district centres. And very quickly, these British detachments became magnets for Taliban. They drew them into the district centres to fight the infidels. And you had pitched battles in district centres between what became known as platoon houses. These were, small British detachments in the key compounds, district government compounds and district centres, waging, using machine guns and mortar fire, exchanging machine guns and mortar fire with the Taliban, and waves of Taliban trying to assault these British platoon houses. So the British are coming under constant attack, very heavy fire. Resupply of these British detachments and in even casualty evacuations becomes a major problem, because every British helicopter that comes in comes under very heavy fire. You know, many of these British detachments begin to become very short of supplies and ammunition. And so really by the summer, Ed Butler, but also the Ministry of Defence, are very concerned about the possibility that they might lose a Chinook helicopter as it comes in to evacuate a casualty or provide resupply. And that in fact leads to a decision for the British to withdraw from Musakala in September. So it's really indicating how this strategy is not working. It's not providing security, it's just generating immense conflict in these district centres, and the British can't hold that far north. And crucially, from Ed Butler's point of view, he concludes the end of the campaign, well, at least we killed a lot of Taliban. That, in his words, it undoubtedly contributed to attrition of Taliban forces, i.e. we killed a lot of Taliban. But the flip side is that, and this is the paradox in counterinsurgency, that killing insurgents doesn't actually mean that there are fewer insurgents, because very often it causes such anger in the local population that enables insurgents groups to recruit more fighters. And whereas the Taliban, as they come in 2005 and 6, are relying very heavily on foreign fighters, these are non-Helmandi, non-Kandahari fighters. Many of them come in actually, really from, might be other parts, Arabic fighters or other parts of Pakistan. But increasingly, actually, they're able to recruit locals to do the fighting. So in October, at the end of the 6-month tour, 16th Air Assault rotates out, and in comes 3 Commander Brigade led by Brigadier Jerry Thomas. And he'd been looking at what had happened and could see that this wasn't working. So his basic plan was to, as he put it, unfix the north in order to take the fight to the Taliban. And at the time, there had been a ceasefire actually in Sangin and Musakala, and that had enabled the British to withdraw. And so that actually provided him with a bit of space. And so he created what he called mobile operations groups. So these were like flying columns of about 40 vehicles, about 250 men. And these would range out in the desert trying to chase down Taliban. And his intent was to create what he called dynamic unpredictability. So by ranging over hundreds of kilometers to, as he put it, engage the enemy at times and places of our choosing. But actually the problem here was that the Taliban could see them coming a mile off, literally, because they'd see clouds of dust, and they had spotters everywhere. So whereas the Westerners didn't really know where the Taliban were, the Taliban could clearly see where the British columns were, and therefore they could determine when the fights would happen. So the last, third brigade I want to look at is the 12th Mechanized Brigade led by John Lorimer. And so again, John Lorimer is looking at what's happening, and he's saying, well, these mobile operation groups, this is not working, so we're going to try something different. And he returns to the original concept, which was to focus on the area around Gereshk and Lashkar and a bit more north, the very lush area here where there's a lot of population, and focus on creating security there. At this time, it was referred to as the Afghan Development Zone. And so his basic intent was to clear this area of Taliban in order to create security. But again, the focus would be on fighting. So he focused on preparing his brigade for a battle. And in fact, they arrived straight into battle because that's what the 3 Commander Brigade were engaged in. And so, in his own view, as he later reported, 12 Mechanized Brigade derived considerable benefit from being pitched straight into offensive battle at the outset. He felt it gave the brigade forward momentum. So he conducted 5 task force level sweeps of the area between Gereshk and Sangin. So he's looking a bit more north of Gereshk. Quite successfully, each sweep would sweep the Taliban before them. But the problem is they wouldn't hold the ground because they would hand over the areas they had cleared to Afghan police and Afghan army. And the simple fact was that there weren't that many Afghan police and army, and those that were there weren't really very good. So what we see is that 12 Mechanized Brigade are successful at clearing Taliban, but they don't hold the ground. And counterinsurgency is all about holding ground. And when we look at the Afghan National Army, for instance, the brigade that was responsible for Helmand, which is 3 Brigade 205 Corps, had only been in existence for 1 year and could only field 2 battalions, and they were really up to much operations. So what we can see in this slide entitled Focus on Fighting is each brigade tries something a bit different. They're facing a situation of rising Taliban insurgency. They're determined to meet the Taliban head on, actually, to defeat it militarily. But rather than actually, bringing security to Helmand, what we see is growing insecurity. So troops in contact is the official term for basically a battle, a firefight. And you see the numbers of troops in contacts, the numbers of firefights between British forces and Taliban just goes up and up and up under each tour. So this next slide outlines what I think outlines a way of thinking about the first 8 tours by British brigades and a series of phases that the British campaign goes through. This first phase that I've just talked about, with these first 3 brigades, is really focused on trying to defeat the Taliban militarily. And as we can see, it's not very successful, quite the opposite. It's feeding the insurgency. So then we have a couple of brigades that follow that just try to take a different approach. And the first one here is 52 Brigade. So this is the Type B Brigade that has turned into a Type A and sent to be deployed because the British Army run out of deployable Army Brigade headquarters. It's led by Brigadier Andrew Mackay. And he's slightly different from the other brigadiers. And he comes from a background where previously he was a policeman in Hong Kong. He's an older guy. He brings a lot of experience from his previous work. And he's determined actually, he's pretty horrified by what he sees in Helmand, which is that the district centres have been destroyed through combat between the British and the insurgents. And he's thinking that this is not counterinsurgency. So his thinking is very influenced by emerging thinking from the United States around a new doctrine for counterinsurgency, which he adopts actually. And it's particularly focusing on the shift is not fighting the Taliban, but securing the communities. So it's really population centric, which is what counterinsurgency should be about. So he does a couple of things. He says we're not going to engage in big battles against the Taliban, or we're not going to move our battalions around, which previously happened because battalions would be sent into a district to provide security, but then pulled out for big operations. He says to his battalions, you're going to go into districts and you're going to be there for your entire tour. So, get to know the locals. He puts a lot of effort into developing ways to influence create influence in the locality, not by using force, but by using other means, non-force. And in the end, he does actually have to conduct a major operation to capture Musakala. He's ordered to do so. But interesting enough, he does it in a way that tries to minimize battle. So he creates intimidation by slowly moving forces up to Musakala to basically encourage the Taliban to cede the ground to him. He's followed by 16th Air Assault Brigade, back for their second tour, led by Brigadier Mark Carlton Smith. Likewise, he's well versed in counterinsurgency doctrine, and he's saying I don't want this tour to be confused with the previous one. We're not going to be engaged in battle. We're going to support the development mission. And true to his word, he really focuses, the big operation that they conduct is to move a turbine that's delivered by, it's from U.S. aid. They sponsor the development of a turbine that's going to go up to Kajaki, and that's going there's a dam up in Kajaki that provides electricity down to Kandahar, and this is part of development. This will increase electricity supply. This is actually an incredibly logistically challenging mission because the turbine's huge, has to be moved very slowly on these giant trucks, and it's deeply vulnerable to insurgent attack. And so 16th Air Assault Brigade conduct what is actually a pretty impressive operation to move it up through a secret road they discover in Kandahar. But that actually dominates his tour. And interesting enough, at the end of it, he gets little thanks from the Americans for conducting quite an impressive move. And unfortunately, in the end, it's not actually installed because there's not sufficient security up in Kajaki itself. And And then so we have another brigade coming in, which is 3 Commander Brigade, again back for its second tour, led by Brigadier Gordon Messenger. And again, this is going to be pretty much around creating security, supporting development. But their plans get knocked sideways because, shortly after the brigade arrives in Lashkar Gah, Lashkar Gah suffers a massive assault by hundreds of Taliban. And this is a very bold attempt by the Taliban to unseat the provincial governor, to seize the jail and release Taliban prisoners, to attack the British main base in Lashkar Gah. And it's repelled by NATO air power. But what 3 Commander Brigade do is they track the Taliban back to where they came from, and they discover that they're coming from Nadi Ali, which is nearby, next district next across. And so that becomes the focus of 3 Commandos tour, which is to project force into Nadi Ali to begin to take control of that district. And that's like, this is a heavily populated district with 30,000 people, with a patchwork of 50 different tribal groups. So, it's quite a challenging counterinsurgency environment. Now, clearing central Helmand actually becomes the focus of the rest of the British campaign. And it's helped by the arrival of the 2nd U.S. Marine Expeditionary Brigade in the summer of 2009. So this is like 10,000 U.S. Marines suddenly flooding into southern Afghanistan. And in particular, the Marines want to take a big chunk of territory as their own operating area. And the British say to them, well, why don't you take southern Helmand? Because that's not the area that we're really focused on, with Garmsir and so forth. The Marines are happy to do so. And that actually takes the pressure off the British. It means they can focus more on central Helmand. Just north of Nadi Ali, which is the area between Nadi Ali and it brings you up alongside Lashkar Gah. It's an area that's heavily occupied by Taliban. And so 19 Brigade launch a major operation called Pangshai Plan to clear this area. It's referred to as the Battle of Babaji. This is an area dense with canals, irrigated fields, villages, about 80,000 inhabitants. It proves to be an incredibly tough fight for the British. Overall casualties for 19 Brigade by the end of the tour were the highest of any British brigade in Helmand, with 78 dead and 328 wounded. So one of the things that we see at this stage is, and I want to talk a little bit about, is around how the Taliban insurgency has evolved. And I'm going to look at 2 things just briefly, the strategic side and the tactical side. So what we see on the strategic side, between 2006 into 2009 and beyond 2010, 11, 12, is a strengthening of centralized control. So the Taliban is a sort of decentralized organization. It's comprised of smaller fighting groups, sort of anywhere between 20 to 50 men. These are aggregated up into fronts, called mahazas. So these fighting groups aggregate under what would be a significant tribal leader, who would be the mahaz or the front commander. But you also have a centralizing ideology. And so gluing together all of these fronts and fighting groups is a strong sense. It's a common Islamic jihad that they're all waging, a common Islamic purpose, but also crucially an ideology of obedience to the emir. Nonetheless, there's a limit to this mahaz system. And it's around about the ability to concentrate force to generate combat power, because it means that sometimes these competing, big Taliban leaders are rivals. Sometimes they're mahazas. They don't really cooperate very well. Sometimes they are even competing against each other. You've seen very little movement between districts or between provinces. So what the Taliban do, is they create 2 military commissions. So from around about 2008, they create 2 military commissions to run the war. You've got the Quetta military commission, which is running the war in the north, the west, and the south, and a military commission that's established in Peshawar to run the war in the east and in Kabul. And actually what this reflects is that a Pashtun terrorist network called the Haqqani network joins the Taliban. And they're very influential, a very powerful group. and with heavily supported actually by the Pakistan intelligence services. And in effect, they take charge of the war in the east, and they dominate the Peshawar military commission. Now, initially, what these military commissions try to do is encourage Taliban commanders to move around, and for a few months, this actually works. So they're trying to create a sort of a professional cadre of military officers in the Taliban. But within a few months, this system breaks down, and not least because these commanders become vulnerable to U.S. drone attacks as they move around. They're very vulnerable. And so from around 2009 onwards, we see the development of a more formalized system of provincial and district military commissions and commissioners. And so fighting groups at a district level, at a very local level, they'll be taking orders both from their front commander, the Mahaz commander, but also the local district military commissioner. And the idea here is to have a bit more centralized effort. At the tactical level, what we see is a shift from conventional to irregular tactics. So, initially, as I said, the Taliban relied heavily on foreign fighters. And then this moves across to recruiting locals to fight for the cause. And this, by the way, just to make one point, is that there are many reasons why people are joining the Taliban, young men, and fighting. So, as I've said, some are coming from Pakistan, some are very driven very strongly by religious, conservative religious teachings. They have a strong sense of Islamic jihad. Some fighters might actually be local communities that are completely fed up with being abused by the militias of local warlords, and so they're tied in with the Taliban as a way to kind of protect themselves. Some might be young men who are basically just looking for a more interesting life than being a farmer. But these motives come together and enable the Taliban, in the climate of growing conflict in Helmand and what is seen as the oppression of Western infidels, to generate actually very sizable forces. And initially, what they're trying to do in 2006 and 2007 is attack the British centre head on, try and overrun British bases or ambush British forces. And we don't know how many Taliban are killed, but it's certainly in the hundreds. What the Taliban progressively do, however, thereafter, is move to more regular tactics using, snipers, suicide vests, but also, more importantly, improvised explosive devices, IEDs. So these will be kind of homemade bombs that are, planted on the roadsides, and they will be either wire detonated or they'll be detonated by somebody stepping on them. And what you can see in this table, Insurgents Adapt, is you can see that increasingly there are more and more IED attacks on British and on Western and Afghan forces. And you can see a very significant increase in IED attacks. This is in Helmand per month. So they jumped from 350 in August 2008 to almost 600 in August 2009 to over 700 in August 2010. And this is a massive problem for the British because actually IEDs become increasingly difficult to detect as the Taliban become more and more sophisticated in manufacturing IEDs with no metal parts. And so this adoption of more irregular tactics is reinforced by a general order from the Taliban military commissions in 2010, and supported by training teams that come in from Pakistan to support Taliban bomb making. Okay, so let's turn to the next section, which is Britain's counterinsurgency war from 2009 to 2011. So, this period, late 2009 to early 2011, is the high point in the West's war on the Taliban. In many ways, it's one last push to try and beat the Taliban. So we see renewed energy and focus that's brought to the war effort by incoming President Barack Obama. If we look at the situation in January 2009, you've got 34,000 US troops in Afghanistan and about 32,000 troops from 41 other NATO nations, NATO and non-NATO. But you don't really have a coherence to the NATO campaign. And you can see it from this very colourful slide here. So you've got, NATO task forces are scattered all over Afghanistan, and they're organised into 4 different regional commands: Regional Command North, Regional Command West, Regional Command South, Regional Command East, and there's a Regional Command Centre, which is really Kabul. But they're not really following a central plan. What you actually have is, within each of these RCs or regional commands, you have a whole series of national task forces, and they're largely following their own campaign plans, and they're taking direction from home capitals. So in January of 2010, Barack Obama, as the incoming president, as president-elect, sends Joe Biden, the vice president-elect, across to Afghanistan to see how the war is going. And Biden straight away picks up that as he puts it when he comes back to President Obama, the war is on autopilot. There isn't really a central direction. There's no unity of command or unity of effort. Obama's view was that the United States had been distracted by Iraq, and that, as he put it, quote, "one of the biggest mistakes we made strategically after 9/11 was to fail to finish the job in Afghanistan." So what he does is he gets America out of Iraq and commits more effort into finishing the fight in Afghanistan, principally because actually he wants to focus on domestic policy. So he approves the deployment of additional 22,000 US troops in March 2009, and a further 33,000 US troops going to Afghanistan he approves in September. And that brings US troop levels to almost 100,000 troops by year's end. He appoints a new commander to lead ISAF and US forces in Afghanistan, General Stanley McChrystal. So McChrystal was considered to be one of America's most dynamic and innovative generals. He had revolutionized the US US Special Operations campaign in Iraq to considerable success. And, as the incoming commander of international US forces in Afghanistan, he seeks to redefine the campaign using classic counterinsurgency principles. So the focus is on the population and not on the enemy. He phrases it as population-centric COIN, or counterinsurgency, but in fact, counterinsurgency in its very nature is supposed to be population-centric. And so he focuses on 3 things at bringing his new approach to the campaign. First and foremost is to protect the population, to protect the people from harm from any cause, insurgent, but also Afghans from the Afghan security forces and from ISAF. So he brings a real focus on reducing civilian casualties from ISAF and Afghan operations, but also protecting the people from corruption. And so he has a big drive about trying to reduce corruption. The second is a focus on the development of the Afghan security forces, so the Afghan National Army and the Afghan National Police. And whereas previously there'd been a tendency for the West to operate from big bases and not really to get close with the Afghan Army and the Afghan Police, not to partner with them in terms of training on the ground, he's saying you have to get out of your big bases, that we have to partner with the Afghan security forces at all levels, from government ministries, but right down to the platoons. And as he puts it, quote, "to live, train, plan, and execute operations together." And this is critical because this is the exit for Western forces. It's only by building up the Afghan security forces to fight for themselves can the West leave. And the third is a focus on governance and development. Again, classic COIN. And he's seeking to support the development, the acceleration of the development of governance in key districts. He identifies 80 key districts where you want to see the development of governance, because this is going to be crucial to winning hearts and minds, to winning support of the population. And in fact, in his assessment, the really serious threat to the Afghan government and into ISAF is less the military action by the insurgents, but actually the growth of Taliban shadow government, which at the time was actually very weak in most respects. The Taliban just weren't very good at governance. But in one respect, they were very good, which is in providing cheap and effective administration of justice. So not cheap's the wrong word, but basically, if you were a farmer and you were in dispute with the neighbor and you wanted to take a case against the neighbour or have a dispute adjudicated through the national court system or the local court system, it was very expensive because you ended up paying bribes the whole way. But if you went to a Taliban shadow court, you didn't have to pay anything. It would be as opposed to something that might last weeks. It would be adjudicated very rapidly, very effectively, and so it was seen as a very effective, non-corrupt form of justice administration. And in that, the Taliban were actually very good. So General McChrystal establishes a new 3-star command called ISAF Joint Command, and its job is to drive more coherence of effort down through the regional commands and the national task forces, and so we get a more coherent effort across the whole of ISAF. But crucially for McChrystal, what he realized was that there was a time limit on the surge forces that he'd been given by President Obama. Obama, when he deployed the extra 33,000 troops, he said, you can have them for a year, but then I want them back. And so McChrystal wanted to make progress quite quickly. He wanted to inflict a big strategic setback on the Taliban in order to demonstrate dramatic progress to Washington and hopefully buy a bit more time. So what he did was he focused most of the surge forces into the south. And you can see in this slide, main effort in the south. So we see the major offensive. First, you can see in the red box that's the uplift of forces, and you can see it's all going into Regional Command South. So there's a major offensive that's launched in late 2009 to clear areas around Kandahar city. The plan for this operation is led by Regional Command South, which is actually under British command, under the command of Lieutenant General Nick Carter. And then from there, which is largely successful actually in creating security around Kandahar city. And then there's a major offensive that follows in early 2010 in southern and central Helmand called Operation Mushtarak. And its purpose was to create the conditions for governance and development. So Operation Mushtarak is launched in February 13th of February 2010. And you can see in this slide clearing central Helmand and the kind of major area of operations for Mushtarak. So it involves 1,200 British soldiers from 11 Brigade, 3,000 US Marines, and 4,400 Afghan troops. The objective for the British was to clear the Taliban from an area north of Nadi Ali called the Shah-e-Anir triangle. So you can see it's the purple triangle just above the green box on the slide. The objective for the US Marines was to clear the Taliban from an area south of Nadi Ali called Marja, which is indicated by the red box, and establish pro-Kabul local governance there. And in particular, this was testing McChrystal's thesis that that ISAF could have governance in a box ready to spring out once you created security. So ISAF forces can go into an area, get rid of the Taliban, and quite rapidly to establish Afghan local governance in that district. So, around 100 helicopters were committed. Arriving in waves, they dropped thousands of British, US and Afghan troops on their target. The British were largely successful in clearing the Taliban out of what was called the Cat Triangle and establishing a persistent security presence. The US Marines, however, had a much harder fight. And essentially, it was an area that which had never experienced Afghan government before. It was heavily controlled by the Taliban. It was a major drug production area. It was just incredibly hard for the US Marines to get rid of the Taliban altogether. In fact, what the Taliban were able to do was just bury their weapons after initial fight, but they were still hanging around. And the attempts to import a local governor, a local district governor, were very unsuccessful. So, by May, the local government had not been established. McChrystal was getting increasingly angry because his strategy was failing, and the Taliban steadily returned. So by 2010-2011, the British military campaign had achieved modest success in Helmand. It had created security in central Helmand. So this is particularly the area around Nadi Ali and Lashkar. It had redefined coin tactics to focus on protecting the population. The British had developed strong intelligence and surveillance capabilities and that was providing them with a very good picture, actually, of the cultural terrain. And the British task force had all the equipment it needed. So, the British task force commander declared in October 2010 that it was, quote, the end of the era of kit being an issue. But importantly, the British had benefited from the US Marines taking charge of the south. And from September 2010, the US Marines also took charge of Sangin and the area north of Sangin. And so, in effect, all the British forces were concentrated in a very kind of much smaller area of central Helmand. And they had very good force-to-space ratio. In late June 2010, General McChrystal was replaced as commander of ISAF by General David Petraeus. So this was the man that was credited with turning around the losing war in Iraq. And so Obama brought him in to lead the war effort. Petraeus shifted the focus of the war effort from protecting the population to defeating the Taliban. He told ISAF troops to, quote, get your teeth into the insurgents and don't let go. And so whereas under General McChrystal, the watchword for the campaign had been courageous restraint, he enforced very strict rules on ISAF troops in terms of using force to protect civilians. That was replaced under General Petraeus with a new watchword, which was relentless pursuit. So Petraeus was quite clearly, in his view, taking the gloves off. And you can see from the next slide, relentless pursuit, that Petraeus began to brief this slide, which is a kill-capture slide, to visiting dignitaries in Washington and NATO capitals. And it shows the sort of 90-day summary of Taliban leaders and Taliban fighters that have been killed or captured from the battlefield. This is, in effect, a body count slide. So when 16th Brigade returned for its third tour, this was what it came back to, this new invigorated campaign under General Petraeus that was focusing back again on fighting the Taliban. It actually found the Taliban quite eager for a fight. And it was heavy fighting that greeted the arrival of 16th Air Assault Brigade in central Helmand. Nonetheless, learning the lessons of previous tours, it really focused on using force in precise ways to minimize, so still taking on the Taliban, but using force in precise ways to minimize civilian casualties and damage. So, in a sense, the attempt to inflict a strategic setback on the Taliban had failed. And by 2011, whilst there was intensification of the effort by the Americans and ISAF, already the Taliban were on the ascendancy. If we think about, where things land about a decade later in March 2021, by that time, the United States has spent over 88 billion on the Afghan security forces, which on paper in 2021 numbered 300,000 soldiers and police. The Taliban were somewhere between 60 and 80,000. Yet in the months that followed, the Taliban swept the Afghan security forces before them and took control of the entire country. So let's look at that period, this path to defeat between 2012 and 2021. I just want to make a couple of general points about why the West's mission in Afghanistan was actually doomed to fail. And there's 2 points here. One was Afghan corruption. So, Afghanistan was one of the most corrupt countries in the world. And this was realized under General McChrystal. By 2009-10, it was fairly obvious to McChrystal and his team that they were dealing with a kleptocratic state. A state where bribes were flowing upwards, from checkpoint commanders to district chiefs of police, for example, provincial chiefs of police, into the Ministry of Interior, and likewise in all the other government ministries. Money was flowing upwards into the Afghan state. And a lot of this money was actually coming from the West. So as part of the West's effort to build up the Afghan state and security forces so they could leave, the West had poured billions and billions of aid into Afghanistan, and somewhat irresponsible because the Afghan state simply lacked the capacity to absorb this amount of development aid in a constructive way. A lot of this aid was extracted through bribes and corruption, fed into the various arms of Afghan government security forces, and fed up and you ended up having, reportedly pallets of money being shipped out of Kabul into banks in Dubai. The United Nations Office for Drugs and Crime in 2012 estimated that in a major survey I did of the Afghan population, reported that up to 50% of Afghans in that year had paid bribes when interacting with public officials to gain a service. And bribes in the amount of almost $4 billion. That's the equivalent of 20% of Afghan GDP at the time. In one stark example of the level of Afghan corruption, in 2010, it was discovered that the Kabul Bank, which was the central bank in Kabul, almost its entire assets, which is almost $1 billion, had been looted. And through the device of unsecured loans that had been given to 19 people, one of whom was Karzai, President Karzai's brother. So, this has enormous impact in terms of how the population sees the government. It's just this highly corrupt regime. It has an impact on the Afghans and national security forces, the Afghan army. A lot of the resources that are being poured into the Afghan army by the West are actually being looted by officers. And so it means that soldiers in the ground, they don't actually have the equipment they need because a lot of the money's been looted. They're not being paid. Eventually that was fixed, but for a large part of the war they weren't being paid. They're not being fed properly, and so forth. In terms of the police, it undermines the police because actually if you're a police officer, and many of the police were highly corrupt and they were only in it in order to establish checkpoints so they could get bribes from locals. It also impacts on elections. So ballot stuffing was extremely common on all sides in the major elections that occurred in Afghanistan. So all of this undermines the legitimacy and credibility of Afghan government and security forces. And it makes it very hard for ISAF to work with their partners to win public support for the Afghan state and security forces, unless you are part of the state and security forces, in which case you benefit. But if you're not part of it, you can just see that all you're doing is having to pay to get access to public services or pay bribes. The second reason why the West's mission in Afghanistan was doomed to fail was the role of Pakistan in supporting the Taliban. And just to kind of understand where Pakistan's coming from, Pakistan is constantly, it looks at Afghanistan as an area of competition, particularly with other regional states and in particular India. So it sees the Tajiks, who dominated Afghan government in 2001 to 2001 to 2021, that 20-year period, as being effectively Indian protégés. And indeed, Hamid Karzai was educated in India and was famously pro-Indian. And so it's quite natural that Pakistan would see the Pashtun Taliban as natural allies because they were in competition with the Tajiks. It also looked at what was happening in the United States, and what we see actually under the Bush administration is a major tilt towards India. And there's a deal in 2005, a nuclear deal, whereby the United States recognizes India as a nuclear power, but it refuses to recognize Pakistan as legitimate nuclear power. But also, the part of the issue was this just sheer popularity of the Taliban cause among the army in Pakistan, but also people in general. So many people in Pakistan, and particularly in the army, identified with the cause of the Taliban, the jihad they were waging against the infidels. And so either you, likewise, if you were in Pakistan and you were a senior official or politician, either you shared the same sympathies, or at the very least you realized that there was no political benefit in going against this popular cause. And so, for instance, one Pew survey that was conducted in Pakistan in 2010 found that 2/3 of people in Pakistan view the United States as an enemy. And if you want to get a sense of, to what extent, were Pakistan a real willing ally of the United States, to what extent was it really playing the two-level game here? Well, just look at the fact that, in fact, Osama bin Laden was given refuge, quite clearly given refuge, by the Pakistan, either army or intelligence services in Pakistan, because he was eventually found by the United States in Abbottabad, which is, a garrison town of the Pakistan army. And the United States conducted a raid on the 1st of May 2011, found him there and killed him. Anyway, by 2010, NATO support for the war had pretty much run out of steam. In January of 2010, France announced that it was withdrawing its forces. In February of 2010, the Dutch government collapsed when it tried to extend the mandate of its mission there. and 6 months later, Dutch forces withdrew from Afghanistan. And Canada withdrew its forces in 2011. If you look at Britain, by 2010, public support to the war had fallen to around about 20%. So David Cameron is the incoming Prime Minister in May 2010. It's quite clear he could see where the politics were going and he needs to chart a path for Britain's exit. He set a date for the withdrawal of British forces to be around about 2015. And then what we see is in 2010, this timeline becomes hardened. So President Hamid Karzai outlines a vision for the phased transfer of responsibility from ISAF to the Afghan security forces, which would see complete transfer of responsibility for security by December 2014. And this date for the withdrawal of NATO combat forces is adopted at the NATO summit in Lisbon in November 2010. So what we have then is between 2010 and the end of 2014 is going to be the phased withdrawal of NATO combat forces. And in effect, this starts a countdown clock. So the official rhetoric is that this will be a conditions-based transition that suggests that as the Afghan security forces become more and more capable, we see NATO draw down in a phased way, but no one was fooled. It was quite clear there was a clock ticking, and no matter what, NATO combat forces would be out by the end of 2014. And this had three implications. The first is that NATO focused increasingly on managing the withdrawal of its forces, because actually that was logistically incredibly challenging. It's called retrograde. And it's withdrawing, you're withdrawing tens and thousands of troops and their equipment. And that was dominating a lot of attention of NATO planners. Secondly is that ISAF became increasingly irrelevant to the Afghan government and the Afghan security forces. So as 2014 approached, increasingly there was less reason for the Afghans to pay any attention whatsoever to their Western advisors, where previously they would pay attention because the Western advisors brought with them a lot of resources. Now they less so. And thirdly, though, most importantly, the Taliban became increasingly emboldened. For them, victory was simply a matter of time. So what we see in 2015 is that NATO shifts to its resolute support mission. So it shifts to a mission that's providing training and assistance to the Afghan security forces. From the point of view of the British mission in Afghanistan, it shrinks very dramatically. And Britain contributes, under our NATO resolute support mission, Britain contributes 850 troops. And it takes responsibility for two key roles. One is the Kabul security force, and the second is for the Afghan Army Officer Academy, which becomes known as the Sandhurst in the Sands. Then in November 2016, we see the election of Donald Trump as President of the United States. And in many ways, this hastens the end of the war. So Trump's on record as dismissing the US war effort as, quote, a complete waste. And he feels that the United States should leave immediately. And he's determined actually to reach a deal with the Taliban because he sees himself as this great deal maker. So the United States enters into peace talks with the Taliban in Doha in July of 2018. And by February of 2020, a deal is reached. And the US negotiators and the Taliban sign what's called an agreement for bringing peace to Afghanistan. And under the terms of this deal, the United States agrees to withdraw all of its forces by April 2021. So in 2020, the US forces had actually already shrunk to about 8,500 troops. So by April 2021, 14 months later, they will all be gone. It's agreed that 5,000 prisoners, Taliban prisoners, will be released from Afghan jails. There's a promise that they're not going to return to the fight, but actually it's 700 of them almost return to the battlefield almost immediately. Very importantly, the United States agrees to halt attacks on Taliban forces, and the Afghan security forces also halt their offensive operations. And what the Taliban promised in exchange is very little, actually. So they promised not to attack major urban centers. They promised to start peace talks with the Afghan government, which they never really, because they just delay. And they promised to prevent terrorists from operating on Afghan soil. So what is presented to the public as a peace agreement looks something very different. It's in very blunt terms, as General H.R. McMaster, the former National Security Advisor under Donald Trump, says. He describes it as, quote, a surrender agreement with the Taliban. Now, the Taliban, they hardly stopped their fighting. They actually used the terms of the Doha Agreement to make significant gains on the ground. So they just engage in fighting at a threshold that's below the level that will be seen as breaching the agreement. And they progressively take control of roads, they cut off supplies to Afghan army bases, and they surround all of the urban centres and major cities that they haven't taken. And the impact on Afghan security forces morale is devastating. As one US analyst puts it, the Afghans, army and police, quote, very quickly ran out of ammunition, food, water. They called for airstrikes and none would come. They called for reinforcements and none would come. So you can imagine the impact on morale. So the Taliban did actually launch, though, one major assault on Lashkar in Helmand in the winter of 2020. And that was quickly repulsed by US air power. And the United Nations, which investigates, subsequently reports that this was most likely a probing exercise to gauge how far conditions of the Doha Agreement could be tested before being challenged by the United States. So the Taliban were quite clearly trying to make as much gains as possible. In November 2020, Joe Biden is elected president of the United States, and this actually doesn't change the trajectory of the US withdrawal, because Biden had come to the conclusion that the US also had to end it. He also felt the US had to end its war effort. And in fact, he'd been a long-standing critic of the counterinsurgency, the scale of the counterinsurgency effort. He wanted a more focused counterterrorism effort in Afghanistan. So Biden was committed to withdrawing US forces on a pretty ambitious timeline. Maybe not by April, but within a few months after that. At that time, there were only 2,500 US troops in Afghanistan. What's really important, though, is that the presence of the US troops enabled a very large contractor workforce, then about 17,000, to stay in the country. And they were maintaining the high-end equipment that was being used by the Afghan army, and particularly the Afghan Commando Corps. So servicing the helicopters, providing the electronic warfare measures, so some of the more sophisticated military equipment. So as following Biden's determination for US troops to pull out, as we see very significant withdrawal of US troops in June and particularly in July, it just leaves all the Western contractors to go in droves. And so the ability of the Afghan army to operate is significantly reduced. And then adding to problems was the incompetent leadership of the Afghan president, who from 2015 onwards is Ashraf Ghani. So he ignores US military advice, which is provided in 2021, that he withdraw forces back to a more defensive line. He's not prepared to give up any ground. And crucially, he fails. By mid-2021, the situation was really dire on the ground. It was clear that the Taliban were on the ascendancy and overrunning Afghan army bases. But Ashraf Ghani fails to mobilize the large tribal militia of the big anti-Taliban warlords in the west and north of Afghanistan. These are people he had disempowered under his presidency. So the Taliban sweep across Afghanistan in July and August of 2021. 12 provincial capitals fell like dominoes in the second week of August. And the Taliban arrive at the outskirts of Kabul on the 14th of August. So turning to the last section of my lecture, which is the fall of Kabul in 2021. Really no one expected the Afghan state to collapse so quickly, least of all the Taliban. On August the 14th, for example, Joe Biden's taking a break at Camp David. The US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken's on vacation in the Hamptons, and the British Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, is on holiday in Crete. And what we see in mid-August is that the situation on the ground is getting really quite desperate in Afghanistan. In mid-August, the Afghan Army Commando Corps pulled back to Kabul to strengthen the defensive lines of the capital city. And we're talking about a densely packed city of about 5 million people. So when the Taliban pull up on the outskirts of the city on the 14th of August, they already have covert Taliban operatives in the city. So they pretty much know what's happening on the ground. But their forces don't sweep in straight away. And instead, they put out a message saying that quote, the Mujahideen of the Islamic Emirate do not intend to enter the city by force because they don't want a bloodbath, basically. So they expect something that would last a number of weeks, sort of negotiated surrender. But instead, President Ghani loses his nerve, and he actually flees the city the following day on the 15th of August, along with his family. And word of this gets out very quickly. So in a matter of hours, the defences of the city collapse, the Afghan army, police and army either just take off their clothes and pretend they're civilians, put on civilian clothes. So the Commando Corps, they just drive out of the city in convoys heading up north towards the Panjshir Valley. So the defences collapse. This leads the Taliban to prepare to enter the city very quickly. Mullah Barada, who's the Taliban, one very senior Taliban leader, holds urgent talks with the commander of U.S. Central Command in Doha, and basically says, look, there's going to be chaos in Kabul. Somebody has to go in to provide law and order. So either the United States deploys troops to provide law and order in Kabul, or we're going to do it. That was exceeding the orders that the US military had. And so what's agreed is that the US forces would fly in to secure the airport, because that's critical for an evacuation that's now going to have to happen, and that the Taliban would go in to secure the city. And so Taliban forces flood in a few hours later. And we see very quickly special units Taliban sends special units to secure key facilities. So the Ministry of Defense, the National Directorate of Security, the Ministry of Communications, and they set up checkpoints all over the city. By Monday, civilians are panicking. Many of the civilians who are in Kabul are aligned one way or another with ISAF in the West. They've had jobs or they've had some association with the West. And so, and many of them may not be Pashtun as well. So they're terrified. And you see thousands of people flooding to Kabul airport to try and get on a plane, and clambering to get on planes to try and get out of Afghanistan. By midday on Monday the 16th, basically the last flights have left. Afghan airspace is closed. There's still thousands of people milling around the airport. And in the days that follow, the Taliban progressively exert more and more control over the city, setting up checkpoints and so forth. But they also put out statements because they're trying to calm people. So they try and reassure people. They say the war is over, that there will be no reprisals against former enemies. And they even hint at, they give vague assurances that women won't be oppressed. And unfortunately, all of these promises prove hollow. So what follows is a massive Western evacuation effort. Already on the 12th of August, the day before the Taliban come in, the British had launched Operation Pitying, which was the British evacuation effort. And 2nd Battalion, the Parachute Regiment, fly into Kabul and immediately get into vehicles and drive out into the streets to pick up British nationals. In Monday and the days that follow, we see 3 battalions of US troops are flown in to secure the airport. They initially actually struggle to control the crowds, but eventually they get control of the airport. And then the days that follow, many nations, the French, the Germans, Denmark, Norway, and Japan, all dispatch detachments of troops and planes to rescue their citizens. So by midweek, the United States, along with the British, have actually taken control of the airport and secured the perimeter. There's about 4,500 US troops at that point on the ground. And the Taliban have taken control of the city. And during this week, the US aren't prepared to go out and get people. So people have to get to the airport. And there's a number of entrances around the airport, but there's a crush of Afghans and Westerners trying to get into the airport to be evacuated. So this is a pretty terrifying ordeal for crowds that include families with young children. One reporter describes Taliban crowd control as, quote, volleys of rifle fire, along with pushing, pulling, beating with wooden sticks, Kalashnikovs, and hoses. And Western troops controlling the entrances also use stun grenades sometimes to keep the crowd back. By the end of the first week, unfortunately, 20 Afghans have actually died in stampedes. So in the second week of the evacuation, we see the United States and German special forces going out into the city to rescue Westerners and bring them back, and also to arrange shuttle buses and to ferry people into the airport. At this point, the British troops are no longer going into the city, and one criticism that's been made of the Foreign Office is that the Foreign Office doesn't provide shuttle buses either. Interesting enough, the Taliban were assisting with the evacuation. So they were marshalling people who had papers to the entrances so they can get into the airport. And they were even creating space for buses to come by. And they were blocking off roads to stop suicide bombers getting near the entrances. So the Taliban actually had an interest in helping the Westerners get out. And so that's exactly what they were doing. And so we also see some sharing of intelligence between the Americans. And the Americans were surprised at how cooperative the Taliban were. Unfortunately, a bomber does get through. And so on the 26th of August, the Islamic State, who were active in Afghanistan at that point, were quite clearly, there was a risk that they were going to try and attack the Westerners as they were going and embarrass the Taliban. And on the 26th of August, we see a catastrophic terrorist attack. So the day before, US officials had warned of specific incredible threats. Western governments advised their citizens to leave the area around the airport immediately. But of course, there was still a crush of people. A terrorist with a suicide vest got through 2 Taliban checkpoints and a US military checkpoint and got to the entrance of Abbey Gate and then detonated his bomb. The explosion killed 170 Afghan civilians and 13 US troops. And what this does is to accelerate the evacuation effort. So, a few days later, on August the 29th, we see the last UK flight leaving Kabul, ending Britain's war in Afghanistan. The US military rearguard followed the day after. Over two weeks, the United Kingdom had evacuated 5,000 nationals and 10,000 Afghans. And the United States had evacuated 6,000 nationals and 118,000 Afghans. And other countries had evacuated people as well. But it still left behind an estimated 250,000 Afghans who, one way or another, have been affiliated with the Western's war in Afghanistan, or the Afghan government, and who were desperately trying to leave. So just finally, a few concluding comments about, what happened after that. At the end of the war, the Taliban arguably were in a more powerful position than they were at the start of the war. 1 week after the end of the evacuation, the West had left completely. Taliban go up to finish off the final resistance, which is in the Panjshir Valley in the north, in the northeast. And after a fierce gun battle, they defeat the anti-Taliban Tajik militia up there. The United States has spent $28 billion over the course of the war arming the Afghan security forces. So we're talking about large stockpiles of equipment and ammunition, artillery pieces, armored vehicles, tens and tens of thousands of night goggles, of rifles and so forth. And the Taliban inherited all of this equipment. So they became incredibly well armed overnight. Interesting enough, during the 1990s, when you took the Taliban government, you actually had, although the Emir, Mullah Omar, was absolute ruler, you actually had 2 centers of power. One was in Kabul and one was in Kandahar, where the Emir was. So it was a kind of clerical court in Kandahar, but you had a kind of more, slightly more moderate regime, center of power in Kabul that were trying to govern the country. What you find in 2021 is something quite different. So the Emir, who's at this point a man called Habibullah Akhundzada, is largely consolidated control, and he rules absolutely from his clerical court in Kandahar. And so we're not seeing this more moderate center of power in Kabul. There are some kind of factions within the Taliban, between the Eastern Taliban, the Haqqanis, and the Southern Taliban, but largely we're seeing a better armed Taliban led centrally by the Emir, which with 100% control over the country. Taliban promises that the government will be different from the 1990s prove completely hollow. So we see a very conservative cabinet that's appointed by Habibullah Akhundzada. We see extensive suppression of the media, and we actually see the Taliban hunting down former Afghan army and police. And also importantly, what we see is the development of a really abhorrent gender apartheid regime. So the ever more tightening of controls over women and girls, the requirement that they cover themselves up in public, the refusal to allow girls over a certain age to go to school and women to go to university, the removal of women from public space, and a return to really the worst days of the 1990s in that respect. Under the Taliban, the economy collapses very quickly. So Afghanistan is an economy it's a very cash-rich economy. It's sustained by large injections of cash by the West over 2 decades. And so with the Taliban coming to power, all of that stops. And that causes a liquidity crisis, which causes the price of goods and food in particular to rise very quickly. And in the context of what had been a very poor crop in Afghanistan in 2021, where there had been 40% crop failure, you see chronic food insecurity very quickly. So the United Nations warns in 2021 that 10 million children in Afghanistan completely depend on aid just to stay alive. And importantly, we see Afghanistan once again becoming a pariah state. So as of today, it's only recognized by Pakistan, by Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. So a really dark chapter, unfortunately, in Afghanistan has now opened. Thanks for listening.